She had gone to the garden to find him. What she found broke something inside her that she did not know could break. His hands were cradling another woman's face gently, the way he had never once touched hers. And his lips, the lips that had spoken her name with such quiet warmth only days before, were pressed against someone else's. Lady Araminta Holt stood frozen at the garden entrance, hidden by shadow, invisible to the man who had made her believe foolishly, completely, that she was the only one he saw. She had two choices in that moment. She could step forward and shatter everything, or she could do what every woman in her position had been trained from birth to do, fold her pain into a neat, quiet corner of her chest, lift her chin, and walk away as though her heart had not just been pulled from her body. She chose the second. But here is the question no one is asking yet. Who was the woman he was kissing? And why did the Duke of Aldenmere look up just 1 second after Araminta turned away, as if he had known she was there all along? If you already have a feeling about where this is going, drop it in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit the subscribe button. We are just getting started. Araminta did not run. Running would have meant she felt something, and she had decided, in the space between one breath and the next, that she would feel nothing at all. She walked back through the garden path the same way she had come, her slippers silent on the stone, her hands folded in front of her the way her mother had taught her, still, composed, the picture of a woman who had nowhere urgent to be. She passed the rose hedge. She passed the old stone bench where she had sat with her younger sister as a child, when their greatest worry was whether the cook would save them tarts from the evening table. She passed the iron gate that led back into the east corridor of Aldenmere House, and only when the gate clicked shut behind her, only when the garden and everything in it was sealed away on the other side, did she allow herself to stop walking. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the corridor and closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could still see it. His hands, that woman's face tilted upward, the ease of it, the terrible ease of it, as though he had done it 100 times before. Araminta breathed in once, slowly, through her nose. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her spine, and walked to her room. She had been in this house for 6 days. She had come as the guest of the Duke's aunt, Lady Cecily Merrow, who had extended the invitation with great warmth and very little explanation. Araminta had accepted because her father had told her to, and because refusing an invitation from anyone connected to the Aldenmere name was not something the Holt family could afford to do, not anymore. Not since the losses of the past 2 years had quietly hollowed out everything her father had built, leaving a beautiful house, a respected name, and almost nothing else behind them. She had known what the visit meant before she packed a single trunk. Everyone knew. The Duke of Aldenmere, Lord Cavendish Wrey, was a man of 31, unmarried, and possessed of the kind of wealth and standing that made entire families rearrange their schedules at a word from his household. His aunt had made her interest in Araminta plain to Araminta's father over dinner one evening in the spring, and the conversation that followed in the carriage ride home had been brief and clear. Her father had not asked her what she wanted. He had looked out the window and said quietly that Lady Cecily was a woman of considerable influence, and that it would be worth Araminta's time to make a good impression. She had understood. She had always understood, even when no one bothered to say the thing plainly. What she had not expected was him. Not the idea of him. She had prepared herself for the idea of him, the title, the duty, the arrangement that would save her family without ever being called an arrangement. She had steeled herself against the cold mechanics of it. What she had not prepared for was the man who had walked into the drawing-room on her second evening at Aldenmere House and looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, with dark, steady eyes that seemed faintly surprised by what they found. He had not said anything remarkable. He had asked her whether she preferred the East Gardens or the grounds near the lake, and she had told him the East Gardens because there was more shade and she burned easily in the sun. He had almost smiled. Not quite. Just the faint shift of something at the corner of his mouth, as though she had said something that interested him. She had told herself it was nothing. She had told herself that every day since, with varying degrees of success. On the fourth day, he had walked beside her during the afternoon promenade, uninvited, without explanation, simply falling into step with her, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. They had talked about the history of the East Wing, which he knew in elaborate detail, and about a book she had been reading, which he had also read and had opinions about that were entirely different from hers. She had disagreed with him directly, without softening it, because she was tired and had forgotten for a moment to be strategic. He had looked at her with that same faint, almost smile, and said quietly that she was the first person in 3 years who had told him he was wrong about anything. She had not known what to do with that. She had thought about it that night, and the night after, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over something small and strange, trying to understand what it is. And then this evening she had gone to the East Garden, because the house was warm and crowded with the guests who had arrived for Lady Cecily's dinner, and she had needed air, and she had thought, without fully admitting it to herself, that he might be there. He had been there. He had not been alone. Araminta sat at the edge of her bed now, still dressed, and looked at her hands in her lap. They were steady. She was proud of that, in a cold, distant way. Her mother had raised her to keep her hands steady. Her mother had raised her to keep everything steady, to be the kind of woman who did not flinch, did not weep in front of anyone, did not allow the cracks to show until she was somewhere entirely private, entirely alone. Her mother had died 4 years ago. The steadiness had outlasted her. The woman in the garden had been beautiful in the way that made a room quieter when she entered it. Dark hair, pale skin, a composure that matched Araminta's own but wore it differently, wore it like armour rather than habit. Araminta did not know her name. She had seen her arrive that afternoon with the rest of Lady Cecily's dinner guests, had noticed her the way you notice someone who moves through a room as though they already own it, and had thought nothing more of it. She was thinking considerably more of it now. What she could not make sense of, what sat in her chest like something lodged and airless, was the look on his face. She had only seen it for a fraction of a second before she turned away. She was not even certain she had seen it correctly. But in that fraction of a second, before his hands had found that woman's face, before the kiss that had unmade something quiet and new inside Araminta, his expression had not been the expression of a man swept away by feeling. It had been the expression of a man doing something he had decided to do. There was a difference. She knew the difference. She had spent enough years watching her father navigate rooms full of people whose smiles meant entirely other things to understand what a calculated gesture looked like when it wore the costume of feeling. And what she had seen in that garden, in that single, unguarded second before she turned her back on all of it, had looked less like longing and more like intention. She did not know what to do with that either. A knock came at her door, soft and brief. She straightened instinctively, smoothing the front of her dress, composing her face into something unremarkable. "Come in," she said. It was one of the housemaids, young and apologetic, who told her that dinner was being served and that Lady Cecily had sent to ask after her. Araminta thanked her, told her she would be down in a moment, and waited for the door to close before she stood and moved to the small mirror above the writing table. She looked at herself for a long moment. Her eyes were dry. Her colour was even. There was nothing on her face that would tell anyone in that dining room what she had seen, what it had done to her. What quiet and foolish thing had been growing in her chest for 4 days and had just been pulled out by the root? Good, she thought. She straightened the collar of her dress, turned from the mirror, and went downstairs. The dining room was warm and bright, full of voices and candlelight, and the comfortable noise of people who knew each other well and were enjoying the fact. Araminta found her place at the table, smiled at the woman seated to her left, accepted a glass of wine from the footman at her shoulder, and kept her eyes moving in the pleasant, unfocused way that indicated general sociability and absolutely nothing else. She did not look toward the head of the table. She did not need to. She could feel when he entered the room. She had been able to feel it since the second evening, which was one of the things she had been most diligently refusing to think about. He came in with Lady Cecily and 2 other gentlemen, all of them mid-conversation, and took his seat with the ease of a man entirely at home in his own house, which of course he was. There was nothing in his manner that suggested the garden, nothing in his face. He greeted the table with the composed warmth of a host who knew his duties and performed them well, and then he reached for his wine-glass, and Araminta looked down at her plate. When she looked up again, he was watching her, not with guilt, not with apology, with that same steady, faintly arrested attention he had turned on her in the drawing-room on the second evening, the one that had no right to mean anything and had somehow meant everything anyway. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds, which was 1 second longer than was strictly proper, and then she looked away with a small, pleasant smile that communicated nothing except that she was a woman perfectly at ease in perfectly ordinary company. But her heart was not at ease, and the woman from the garden was seated 3 places to his right, looking at the table arrangement with the quiet satisfaction of someone who already knew exactly how the evening would end. Araminta picked up her fork, took a precise and unhurried bite, and told herself, for what felt like the 100th time, that she did not care. She was beginning to understand that the telling was not working. Dinner lasted 2 hours. Araminta knew because she counted the courses, and between each one she gave herself a small, private task. Eat slowly. Listen to the man on her left who was talking about his estate in Shropshire. Laugh at the right moments. Refill her wine-glass only once. She was good at this. She had been good at this since she was 17, when her mother's illness had made it necessary for her to start attending functions in her mother's place, standing in rooms full of people who asked after her mother with kind eyes, and then moved on to more comfortable conversations. She had learned early that a room full of people was its own kind of performance, and that the most important thing was never to let the performance slip. By the time Lady Cecily rose to signal the end of the meal, Araminta's face ached faintly from the effort of keeping it pleasant. She set her napkin down, pushed back her chair with the careful grace that had been drilled into her in the schoolroom, and followed the other women into the drawing-room while the men remained behind for their port and their low, unhurried talk. The drawing-room was done in cream and pale gold, warm from the fireplace, the kind of room that was designed to make women feel settled and decorative. Araminta sat near the fire because the evening had turned cold, and because it gave her something to look at that was not another person's face. She accepted tea from the housemaid and held the cup in both hands and let the warmth of it travel through her palms. The woman from the garden sat across the room near the window. Her name, Araminta, had gathered over the course of dinner, was Isolde, Lady Isolde Farwell, the daughter of an earl, recently returned from 18 months in Florence with her widowed aunt. She was the kind of woman people described as striking rather than pretty, which was a more interesting thing to be. And she wore her composure with the particular ease of someone who had never once had to think about whether she deserved to take up space in a room. Araminta had been watching her without appearing to watch her, which was a skill she had developed out of necessity and refined out of survival. What she could not determine was what Isolde Farwell was to the Duke, not because the answer seemed complicated, but because the question itself felt more layered than it had any right to be. A man did not hold a woman's face in his hands in a garden if she was merely a family acquaintance. But a man who had just kissed a woman in a garden did not look across a dinner table at someone else with that kind of quiet, arrested attention, unless something about the situation was not what it appeared. She told herself she was not owed an explanation. She told herself this with considerable force. The men joined them a half-hour later, and the drawing-room rearranged itself the way it always did, small groupings, easy conversations, the particular social geometry of people who knew how to fill a room without crowding it. Araminta spoke to Lady Cecily for a while, who was warm and sharp, and asked the kind of questions that sounded like pleasantries but were not. She asked Araminta whether she found the country air agreeable, whether she was fond of riding, whether she had siblings. Araminta answered all of it with pleasant honesty, because Lady Cecily was not a woman you could manage, with vague answers and a pretty smile. She had tried on the first evening and had been gently dismantled. She had grown to respect her enormously because of it. What Araminta had not told Lady Cecily, what she had not told anyone in this house, was the full shape of why she was here. The version she had offered was simple and truthful. As far as it went, she was a family friend, a guest, grateful for the invitation. What she had not said was that her father had sat across from her 3 weeks before her arrival and told her, with the quiet exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something heavy for too long, that they were in difficulty. Not ruinous difficulty, not the kind that ended in scandal and public disgrace, but the slow, grinding kind that wore a family down quietly, year by year, until the house was still standing and the name was still respected and there was almost nothing left behind either of them. He had not asked her to save them. He was not that kind of man. He had simply told her the truth, and he had looked at his hands while he told it, and she had understood from the look on his face that he was ashamed, which was the part that had hurt the most. Her father was a good man. He had loved her mother completely and had never once made Araminta feel like a burden or a bargaining piece. She did not want to think of him as ashamed. She had told him she understood. She had told him not to worry. She had said both things quietly and meant them completely, and then she had gone upstairs and sat on the window seat in her room and looked out at the garden below and let herself feel, for exactly 1 hour, the full weight of what it meant. After the hour was up, she had dried her face, stood, and begun thinking practically. That was what she did. It was the thing about her that most people either admired or found unsettling, depending on how much they valued feeling over function. Her mother had called it her great strength. One of her older cousins had once told her, with affectionate cruelty, that she was the least romantic creature she had ever met. Araminta had not argued. She had simply filed the observation away alongside all the others and moved forward. She was beginning to wonder, with some discomfort, whether she had miscalculated, because what she felt now, sitting in the drawing-room with her tea gone cold in its cup, watching Cavendish Wrey work his way through the room, the way a man worked through a room he owned, which again he did, was not the clean, functional feeling of a woman executing a plan. It was something messier than that, something that sat low in her chest and did not respond to practical thinking the way it was supposed to. She had made a mistake somewhere between the second evening and the fifth. She had let herself be interested, not in the arrangement, not in the practical outcome, but in him, in the specific, particular person of him, the the way he listened when she spoke, the way he had disagreed with Lady Cecily at dinner on the third evening with quiet certainty and then immediately conceded when she produced a better argument, the way he had once paused on the garden path and crouched down to look at something in the flower bed and then stood and said nothing about it, as though he simply needed to look at it and had no desire to explain. She did not know very many people who did things without explaining them. She had liked it unreasonably. She was thinking about all of this, cataloguing it carefully, and telling herself she was only doing so in order to dismantle it, when he appeared at the edge of her peripheral vision and stopped. "You are very far away this evening," he said. His voice was low, which she had noticed from the beginning. It was the kind of voice that did not need to fill a room, that assumed the room would quiet itself to accommodate. She had found it irritating at first, the kind of unconscious ease that came only from a lifetime of being listened to. She no longer found it irritating. That was the problem. She turned to look at him with the pleasant, unremarkable expression she had been wearing all evening. "I am exactly where I have been for the past hour," she said, "near the fire." "I know where you are," he said. "I said you were far away." She looked at him for a moment. He was watching her with the same directness that had disoriented her on the second evening. The attention that did not glance away when she met it, that held steady in a way that made her feel simultaneously seen and uncertain. "Perhaps I am tired," she said. "Perhaps," he said, and the word was not agreement. He did not press further, which was either courtesy or strategy, and she was no longer certain which it was. He stood beside her for a moment, looking toward the fire, and the silence was not uncomfortable, which was itself uncomfortable, because she had been relying on discomfort to maintain her distance. "Lady Farwell tells me you were in the same schoolroom together," he said, after a moment. Araminta was quiet for one careful second. "For 1 year," she said. "When I was 12. We have not been close since." She spoke of you warmly. "She is gracious," Araminta said, with perfect pleasantness and absolutely no warmth at all. He turned his head and looked at her. She kept her eyes on the fire. She could feel the look the way you could sometimes feel heat from a distance, before you were close enough for it to touch. "Araminta," he said. She turned at the use of her name, because he had never used it before, not without her title, not without some buffer of formality between them. The sound of it in his voice did something to her composure that she did not have the vocabulary to describe, which was deeply inconvenient. "Yes," she said. He opened his mouth, and then something across the room caught his attention, and his expression shifted, and the moment, whatever it had been, whatever it was about to become closed, before it could open fully. "Forgive me," he said. "Lady Cecily needs me." He turned and walked away, and Araminta stood by the fire and watched him go and said nothing, and kept her hands entirely still, and felt something in her chest pull tight and stay there. She looked toward Lady Isolde Farwell, who was watching her from across the room with a small, knowing smile, the kind of smile that belonged to a woman who understood exactly what she had just interrupted. And for the first time that evening, Araminta's composure cracked, just slightly, just for a second, a faint, involuntary tension at the corner of her jaw that she smoothed away before anyone could see it. But she had felt it, and it told her something she had been refusing to hear. She was not as untouched by all of this as she needed to be, and someone in this room already knew it. Araminta did not sleep well that night. She lay in the wide, unfamiliar bed of her guest room at Aldenmere House, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the house settle around her, the creak of old timber, the distant sound of wind moving through the grounds, the occasional soft step of a servant in the corridor, and told herself she was being foolish. The problem with telling herself she was being foolish was that she could not argue herself out of what she had seen. Lady Isolde Farwell had looked at her across that drawing-room with the specific satisfaction of a woman who understood the terrain and knew her position on it. That was not imagination. That was not the tired misreading of an evening that had already taken too much from her. That was information. And Araminta had spent enough of her life learning to read the rooms she moved through to know the difference between a glance and a message. The message had been clear. You are visible. I see exactly what you feel, and I am not afraid of it. She rose before the household, which was a habit she had kept since childhood. Her mother had been an early riser, and Araminta had formed herself around her mother's rhythms in the way that children did, quietly and without knowing it, until the habit outlasted the person and became simply part of who she was. She dressed without ringing for the housemaid, which she knew the staff found eccentric, and her father had always called independence, and she went downstairs while the house was still grey and quiet, and let herself out through the side entrance into the east garden. The morning was cold and clear, the grass still silver with dew, the sky in the east just beginning to separate itself from the dark. She walked the garden path with her hands clasped behind her back, and let herself think without managing the thoughts. This was the other thing she did, the thing that balanced the practicality she gave herself 1 hour in the morning usually, to simply feel whatever was there before she put it away again. Her mother had taught her that too. She had said, once, that a feeling ignored did not disappear. It only went underground, and underground things had a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. What surfaced now, in the cold and quiet of the morning garden, was something she had been successfully avoiding since she arrived. She did not want the arrangement any more. She had wanted it, or rather, she had accepted it, which was as close to wanting as she had permitted herself when she arrived at Aldenmere House 6 days ago. She had understood the terms, had seen the shape of what was being offered, and had made peace with the practical necessity of it. A good match, a secure future for herself, and stability for her father. She had told herself it was enough, and had believed it, mostly, because the alternative was a feeling she did not know what to do with. The alternative was that she wanted something real, something that had nothing to do with her father's accounts, or the Aldenmere name, or any of the invisible negotiations happening in the rooms she moved through. She wanted the thing that had happened on the 4th day, when Cavendish Wrey had fallen into step beside her without explanation, and talked to her as though she was someone worth talking to. She wanted that, plainly and inconveniently, and the wanting sat in the middle of everything else like a stone she could not shift. And she did not know what he wanted. That was the part she could not resolve. She did not know what the garden had been about, or what Isolde Farwell was to him, or what it had meant when he said her name, the way he had said it last night, not her title, her name, with something in it that had not been casual. She did not know whether she was a prospect, a distraction, a complication, or nothing at all, and not knowing was a particular kind of torment for a woman who had built her entire survival on being able to read a situation clearly. She heard footsteps on the garden path behind her and turned before she thought better of it. It was him. He was dressed for riding, which meant he had also risen early, or perhaps had not slept at all. There were shadows beneath his eyes that she had not noticed the evening before, and his expression in the early morning light was different from his drawing-room, expression less composed, more direct, as though the performance of the evening had been put away along with the dinner clothes. He stopped when he saw her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I did not expect to find anyone here," he said. "Nor I," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unhurried attention, and then he came forward and stopped a few feet away, and they stood together in the grey morning light, with the cold air moving between them and the rest of the house still sleeping. "I owe you an explanation," he said. Her heart made a single hard movement in her chest. She kept her face neutral with some effort. "You owe me nothing," she said. "We are not acquainted closely enough for obligations of that kind." "You were in the garden last evening," he said, "before dinner." She was very still. "I do not know what you mean." "Yes, you do," he said, quietly, without accusation. "You were at the gate. I saw you turn away." She had thought she was invisible. She had been so certain she was invisible. The certainty of it crumbled now, and she felt, beneath it, the exposure of being seen in a moment she had believed was entirely her own. She did not look away from him. "Then you have your answer," she said, "and I have mine. I do not think we need to discuss it further, Araminta." Again, that use of her name. Again, the thing it did to the steadiness she was working so hard to maintain. What you saw was not what it appeared. She was quiet for a moment. A bird called somewhere in the garden, once and then again. The sky was lightening slowly in the east. "That is what men say," she said, "when they have been caught." Something moved in his face. Not guilt. She had been watching for guilt, and it was not that. Something more complicated, something that looked, in the growing morning light, almost like pain. "Isolde Farwell and I have a history," he said. "Not a present, a history. What happened last evening was her doing, not mine, and it ended before it began." He paused. "I know that is an incomplete explanation. I know it asks you to take my word for something you have no reason to take my word for. But I need you to know that when I looked up and saw you turn away, He stopped. She waited. "It mattered," he said, "that you were there, that you saw. It mattered to me in a way I was not prepared for." Araminta stood very still and looked at him and felt something in her chest moving in a direction she had told it not to move. And beneath the feeling was something quieter and more dangerous, the beginning of belief. The terrible, risky beginning of it. "Why does it matter?" she said carefully. "What I see." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know why," he said. She did not answer that. She could not answer it without giving him something she was not certain she could afford to give. Not yet. Not while Isolde Farwell was sleeping 3 doors down the corridor, and her father's situation was still what it was, and she still did not know the full shape of anything. "Lady Farwell called on me this morning," she said instead, which was not true, because the house was barely awake, but she needed to change the direction of this conversation before it took her somewhere she could not come back from. He frowned. "This morning?" "Last evening," she corrected. "After you left the drawing room." She sat beside me. His expression tightened in a way that told her she had finally found something he had not been expecting. Good. She needed something she had not been expecting either. "What did she say to you?" he asked. "She was very pleasant," Araminta said. "She asked after my family. She expressed great interest in the Holt estate." She paused, and let the pause carry what she was not saying directly. "She is remarkably well informed about our circumstances." The shift in his face was immediate and complete. The composed ease of the man who had walked into the garden dissolved into something sharper and colder, a focused attention that was entirely different from the warmth of a moment ago. He was not a young man performing authority. He was a man who actually had it, and who was now applying it to something that displeased him. "She said nothing to you directly?" he said. "She was very pleasant," Araminta repeated. "She said nothing that could be objected to. She simply made clear that she knew rather more about my situation than a woman I shared a schoolroom with briefly at the age of 12 ought to know." He was quiet for a moment, His jaw was set. He looked past her at the garden, and she could see him thinking, not the easy, social thinking of a dinner table, but the concentrated thinking of someone working through a problem with real edges. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "I generally do," she said. "Did my aunt invite you here?" The question was unexpected. She blinked. Lady Cecily extended the invitation. "Yes." "Did she invite you, or did someone ask her to?" Araminta was very still. She thought of her father's face in the carriage on the way home from that dinner in the spring, the way he had looked out the window, the quiet exhaustion of it. She thought of all the things she had not asked because she had not wanted the answers. "I don't know," she said, and it was the most honest thing she had said to him. He looked at her for a long moment, and his expression was not what she had expected. She had expected something clinical. What she saw was something careful, and beneath the carefulness, something that looked almost like regret. "There are things happening in this house," he said quietly, "that you should not have been brought into. I did not know until last night the full extent of it, and now that I do—" He stopped. He looked at her with an expression she had no name for. "I need you to be careful, Araminta. Do not be alone with Lady Farwell. Do not discuss your family's affairs with anyone in this house except me." She stared at him. "Why?" He opened his mouth, and then, from somewhere inside the house behind him, a door opened, and voices carried out into the morning air, and the moment fractured. He stepped back, his face closed. The composure returned like a curtain drawn across a window. "Trust me," he said, very quietly. "Please." And then he turned and walked back toward the house, and Araminta stood alone in the cold morning garden, with the dew soaking through her slippers, and her heart loud in her ears, and a question sitting in the centre of her chest that she could not name yet, but already could not ignore. What had Isolde Farwell told him last night, and what had it changed? Araminta went inside. She changed her slippers, smoothed her hair, and came down to breakfast as though the morning had been entirely ordinary. The breakfast room was half full. Lady Cecily sat at the head of the table with her tea and her newspaper, presiding over the meal with the unhurried authority of a woman who had never once questioned her right to the chair she occupied. Two of the gentlemen from the previous evening's dinner were already eating, talking between themselves about horses. A young woman Araminta had barely spoken to was buttering her toast near the window with great concentration. Lady Isolde Farwell was not there. Araminta sat, accepted coffee from the footman, and allowed herself the small, private relief of not having to manage her face across a table from that woman. She ate. She listened to the conversation around her. She answered Lady Cecily's questions about whether she had slept well, and whether she found the east bedroom too cold, with the particular pleasant ease she had been performing since she arrived, and none of it touched what was moving underneath. He had told her to be careful. He had told her there were things happening in this house that she should not have been brought into. He had looked at her with something close to regret and asked her to trust him, and then he had walked away before she could ask him anything, and she had spent the walk back through the garden, turning over every word, every pause, every shift of expression, looking for the thing he had not said. She had found several candidates. The one she kept returning to was the simplest and also the most unsettling. He had not known the full extent of it until last night. That was what he had said. Something had changed for him in the drawing room, after he left her side and went to Lady Cecily, or before or during some piece of information had landed that had altered his understanding of the situation. And whatever it was, it involved her family's circumstances, and Isolde Farwell, and apparently this house itself. She needed to know what it was. She also needed, before she could pursue that, to understand what Isolde Farwell had actually come to Aldenmere for, because it was no longer possible to believe that the woman's presence was incidental. The kiss in the garden could have been exactly what he said. It was a history, not a present, her doing rather than his. Araminta was reserving judgment on that, as she was reserving judgment on most things until she had better information. But the conversation in the drawing room, Isolde sitting beside her, with all that pleasant warmth and all that precise, probing knowledge of the Holt family's difficulties that had not been accidental. That had been a woman taking a careful measurement. Of what, exactly, was the question? She was still turning it over when Lady Cecily looked up from her newspaper and said, without preamble, "I should like to walk with you this morning, Araminta, if you are willing." It was phrased as a question. It was not a question. "Of course," Araminta said. They walked the long path that ran along the southern edge of the grounds, past the formal gardens and out toward the open parkland where the grass grew longer and the trees were old and wide and cast deep shade in the summer. Lady Cecily walked slowly and steadily, with a cane she wielded with more elegance than most people managed without one, and she talked about the grounds and the history of the eastern wall and a particularly fine oak she wanted Araminta to see, and Araminta listened and said the right things and waited. She did not have to wait very long. "You are a composed young woman," Lady Cecily said after a while. "That is rarer than it ought to be." "My mother," Araminta said simply. "Yes, I knew your mother slightly. She was remarkable." A pause. "She would have handled all of this with considerably more grace than any of us deserve." Araminta looked at her. "All of what?" Lady Cecily stopped walking. She turned to face Araminta with the direct regard of someone who had decided to stop being oblique, and Araminta felt, in the shift of the moment, the ground changing underfoot. "I invited you here," Lady Cecily said, "because my nephew asked me to. The morning air was very still." "I see," Araminta said. "He had encountered your father at his club some months ago. I don't believe your father said anything directly. But Cavendish has always been observant, and he came away from that conversation concerned." She paused. "He asked me to arrange a meeting. He asked me to make it natural, so that nothing would feel pressured or transactional." She looked at Araminta steadily. "He wanted to meet you on even ground. He was quite particular about that." Araminta was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the old oak at the end of the path, the one Lady Cecily had wanted her to see, and she was thinking about her father's face in the carriage, and about the word particular, and about what it meant that the man she had been trying to keep herself from trusting had arranged this entire meeting because he wanted it to be honest. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because Isolde Farwell arrived 2 days ago uninvited," Lady Cecily said, "and I believe she came because someone told her what Cavendish was planning, and I believe she came to disrupt it, and last night she said something to you that I am quite certain was designed to destabilize you, and I want you to know that she is not what she presents herself to be." Araminta turned to look at her fully. "Who is she?" Lady Cecily's expression was controlled, but beneath the control was something that looked like anger held a long time. "She is the daughter of a man who has a great deal of interest in this estate, and in my nephew's affairs. Her father and Cavendish's father had an arrangement years ago that soured badly. There are debts involved, and disputed land, and the kind of old grievance that men in this class carry forward and dress in new clothes every generation." She paused. "Isolde is her father's instrument. She always has been. She is very gifted at it." Araminta let this settle. It settled in layers, each one uncovering something beneath it. The precision of Isolde's knowledge about the Holt family, the kiss in the garden, which looked different now, not a woman pursuing a man she wanted, but a woman creating a scene she needed someone to see. The smile across the drawing room, which was not the smile of a rival in love. It was the smile of a woman who had executed something well. "She wanted me to see the garden," Araminta said. "It was not a question." Lady Cecily looked at her. "I suspect so." "Why?" "Because a woman who walks away from a duke is a woman who has decided it is not worth the difficulty," Lady Cecily said. "And if you walk away, the field is clear." Araminta was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the old oak and the long pale grass of the parkland and the sky above it, high and clear and indifferent, and she thought about the shape of the past 6 days rearranged into this new configuration, and she felt something in her chest that was not the smooth, practical feeling she had been relying on, but something raw and more insistent. She had been a piece in someone else's game without knowing it. That was familiar. She had been a piece in her father's game without knowing it, and in Lady Cecily's, and apparently in Cavendish's. Even if his intentions had been more honest than the others, she was tired of it. She was quietly, deeply tired of being the variable in other people's calculations, the element arranged and managed and moved without being consulted. She turned to Lady Cecily. "Where is he this morning?" Lady Cecily studied her for a moment with an expression that held something like satisfaction. "He rode out an hour ago. He should be returning within the half hour." She paused. "He is aware of most of what I have just told you. He has been trying to manage the situation with Isolde without allowing it to damage anything here." Another pause, carefully weighted. "He has not been entirely successful." "No," Araminta said, "he has not." She walked back to the house alone, quickly, with the specific, purposeful energy of a woman who had made a decision and was moving toward it before she could talk herself out of it. The composure was still there. She was not made differently by a single morning's conversation, but beneath the composure was something that had stopped being careful. She was done being careful. She had been careful for 6 days, and had ended up standing in a cold garden watching a performance designed to send her away, and she had very nearly let it work. She was in the front hall when she heard hooves on the gravel outside. She went to the door. She did not ask the footman to open it. She opened it herself, which was irregular, and she did not care. He was dismounting in the drive, handing his horse to the groom, still in his riding coat, his hair disordered by the wind. He looked up when the door opened and saw her, and whatever he had been thinking about on the ride fell away from his face. She walked down the steps toward him. "I know," she said, when she was close enough for only him to hear. "About your aunt's invitation, about your father's arrangement with Lord Farwell, about what Isolde was sent here to do." She paused. "I would like you to tell me the rest of it yourself, so that I am not relying on information I have assembled from other people, and so that we are having an actual conversation rather than a series of managed impressions." He was very still. The morning light was clear and unsparing, and his face in it was open in a way she had not seen it before, the composure stripped back to something genuine. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Tell me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Come inside," and the words were quiet and direct. And she followed him through the door and into the study off the front hall, which was small and book-lined and entirely private, and he closed the door behind them and turned to face her. "Isolde's father has been trying for 3 years to acquire a portion of the Aldenmere land that borders his estate," he said. "He has tried legally, unsuccessfully. He has attempted to negotiate, unsuccessfully. Last year he began suggesting that a marriage between Isolde and me would resolve the dispute without litigation." He paused. I refused, twice. She came to ensure you had nothing better to choose, Araminta said. Yes. She looked at him. And my father's situation, what do you intend there? He held her gaze. Nothing that resembles a transaction, he said. I want to be very clear about that. I have no interest in purchasing a wife to satisfy an obligation or repair a connection. What I told you in the garden this morning was the truth. What I feel. He stopped. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the second evening, that direct, arrested attention. What I feel when I am near you is not strategy. Araminta's heart was loud in her ears. She held on to the practical part of herself with some effort. That is a great deal to say to someone you have known 6 days. I know, he said. It is also exactly what I needed to hear, she said quietly, which makes me suspicious of it. Something moved in his face. Not hurt, it was more interesting than hurt. You think I know what you need, and I'm saying it deliberately. I think, she said carefully, that you are a man who is accustomed to having the full measure of a situation. I think you have had the full measure of me from almost the beginning, and I think I have been somewhat behind. He was quiet for a moment. And now? She looked at him. She thought about her mother's voice and her father's face and the long, exhausting project of being steady in rooms that required it, and the feeling she had been refusing since the 4th day, the one that did not care about arrangements or obligations or what was practical. Now I am caught up, she said. And then, from somewhere above them in the house, a door slammed hard enough to shake the frame, and a voice carried down the stairs, sharp and carrying, and Araminta recognized it before she could place it. And then she placed it. Isolde. She was not pleasant now. The warmth was gone entirely, and what replaced it was something much less careful, the voice of a woman who had just discovered that the careful work of 2 days had come undone. Cavendish's expression had gone still and cold in the way she now recognized as his version of controlled fury. Stay here, he said. I will not, she said. He looked at her. 1 second. She met it without flinching. Then stay close, he said, and he opened the study door. They went up the stairs together, Cavendish 2 steps ahead, Araminta close behind him, and the voice above them was getting sharper and clearer with every step. By the time they reached the upper corridor, it had resolved into words, and the words were directed at Lady Cecily, who was standing outside the door of the large guest room at the end of the hall, with the stillness of a woman who had faced considerably worse than this and found it merely tedious. Isolde was in the doorway. She was dressed impeccably, her dark hair smooth, her posture correct, and none of it matched the voice coming out of her, which had dropped every pretense of warmth and was speaking with the clipped, pressurized energy of a woman who had run out of patience for the careful version of what she wanted to say. You invited her deliberately, Isolde was saying. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you did not have the decency to tell me before I... She stopped when she saw them at the end of the corridor. The silence that followed was the particular kind that had weight to it, the kind that pressed down on everyone inside it. Araminta felt it on her shoulders and kept her posture straight and her face entirely neutral and weighted. Isolde's eyes moved from Cavendish to Araminta, and then back to Cavendish, and something in her face shifted through several things quickly before it settled on the expression she had apparently decided to wear, which was composed and cold, and nothing like the warmth she had performed across 2 days of careful, surgical pleasantness. Cavendish, she said. Her voice was level now. Whatever had cracked through in the corridor had been put back. Isolde, he said. His was level too, but underneath the levelness was something hard and immovable, the tone of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in being argued away from it. "I would like to speak with you privately." "I don't think that is necessary," he said. Her jaw tightened. "What I have to say concerns matters that are not appropriate for general company." "Araminta is not general company," he said simply. "Say what you came to say." It was the first time he had placed her beside him publicly and without qualification, and Araminta felt it the way you felt, a hand extended to you in the dark, the specific relief of it, the warmth, and underneath both the faint vertigo of allowing yourself to receive it. Isolde looked at her. The look was not hostile. It was something more controlled than hostility, more purposeful. An assessment, a recalculation. "Your family is in debt," Isolde said to Araminta directly, with the pleasant, precise voice she had used in the drawing room. "Your father borrowed against the estate 3 years ago, and the terms are unfavourable and becoming more so. The Holt name is respected. The Holt finances are not." Araminta looked back at her without expression. "I am aware of my family's situation," she said. "Then you are aware," Isolde said, "that a connection to the Aldenmere name would resolve it cleanly, which means you are not here because of any feeling. You are here because you need to be." The corridor was very quiet. Lady Cecily had not moved. Cavendish was still beside Araminta, close enough that she could feel the tension in him, the held stillness of a man exercising considerable self-control. "That is a very thorough summary of my circumstances," Araminta said. "You have missed one detail." Isolde waited. "You are describing my situation as I understood it when I arrived," Araminta said. "It is not how I understand it now. People are allowed to arrive at things differently than they expected." Something moved in Isolde's face, just briefly. Not hurt something more complicated, something that looked, for one unguarded second, like recognition, as though she understood exactly what Araminta meant, and the understanding cost her. Then it was gone. "My father will move against this estate within the month," Isolde said, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now, the last of it stripped away, and what was underneath was not cruelty so much as exhaustion. "There are documents. Agreements signed by the late Duke that my father has spent 3 years preparing to use. Cavendish can contest them. It will take years and cost considerably more than the land in question is worth." She paused. "There is one arrangement that ends it cleanly and without damage to either family." She did not say what the arrangement was. She did not need to. Cavendish's voice, when it came, was quiet and absolute. "No." Isolde looked at him. "You have not heard." "I do not need to hear it," he said. "The answer is no. It has been no for 3 years, and it remains no, and it will not change, because your father has manufactured a legal threat that he will find considerably more difficult to pursue than he imagines." He paused. "I have had my own solicitors reviewing those documents for the past 4 months, Isolde. I know what they contain. I know what they do not contain. And I know that your father's position is considerably less secure than he has presented it to be." The silence that followed this was different from the previous one. It had a different texture, the quality of air after something that had been pressurized releases. Isolde was very still. "He told you," she said. "No one told me," Cavendish said. "I paid attention." She looked at him for a long moment, and Araminta watched her face move through something private and complicated, and for the first time since the garden she felt something other than wariness toward this woman. Not sympathy exactly, something quieter than that. The recognition that Isolde Farwell was not simply an antagonist. She was a woman who had been sent here by her father to do a thing she had perhaps not chosen, and who had done it well and completely, and was now standing in a corridor watching it come apart. And the composure she was wearing over all of that was not very different from the composure Araminta had been wearing over her own quietly difficult situation for the better part of 3 years. It was not the same thing. She was not going to pretend it was the same thing, but she understood the shape of it. "If your father pursues this," Cavendish said, more quietly now, "he will find that I am not unprepared, and I will not be gentle about it. I have been patient because I had no desire to cause damage to anyone in your family unnecessarily. That patience has a limit." He paused. "Tell him it has been reached." Isolde looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at Araminta with an expression that was stripped of everything except something very bare and very tired. "He is not performing," she said, and Araminta understood she did not mean it as a warning. She meant it as something else, something that cost her. "Whatever you are thinking about whether to trust him, he is not performing." Araminta looked back at her and did not say anything, because there was nothing that could be said to that which would not have been either too much or too small. Isolde straightened. She looked at Lady Cecily, who had stood through all of it with the composed patience of a woman who had known how this would end and had simply been waiting for it to get there. "I will leave this afternoon," Isolde said. "I will have your things prepared," Lady Cecily said, with neither warmth nor coldness, and the matter was settled. Isolde walked back into her room and closed the door behind her, and the corridor breathed again, and Lady Cecily turned and went back toward the staircase with her cane and her upright bearing and said, without looking back, "I believe there is still coffee in the breakfast room," which was as close as she would come to leaving them alone, and was understood as such. Cavendish did not move immediately. He stood in the corridor and looked at the closed door for a moment, and Araminta stood beside him and did the same, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that did not need to be filled. "Are you all right?" he said, after a moment. "Yes," she said. It was true. The morning had been a great deal, and she would need some time, later, in private, to sit with all the parts of it that needed sitting with. But in this moment she was steady and clear and more honest with herself than she had been in several days. "What she said," he began, "was true," Araminta said. "I know it was true. I told you on the second day that I burned easily in the sun, not that I arrived here with entirely pure motives. Both things can be true. I was honest with you from the beginning. I was simply not honest with myself." He turned to look at her. The morning had taken the last of the careful distance from his expression, and what was left was simply him, direct and steady, and looking at her as though she was the most interesting and most important thing in his immediate landscape, which was a great deal to be looked at as, "I arranged this meeting," he said, "because I encountered your father and understood something was wrong and wanted to help without humiliating him. I will not pretend I acted without self-interest. I had been told a great deal about you before we met by Cecily, and I was curious. That is also true." He paused. "What I did not anticipate was the fourth day." She looked at him. "The walk? You disagreed with me," he said, without softening it, without checking first whether I was the kind of man who needed it softened. Something in his face was very quiet and very honest. "I cannot explain how long it had been since someone did that." Araminta felt something in her chest open slowly, the way a window opened on a cold morning, carefully, just enough to let the air through. "You were wrong about the book," she said. "I was," he said, thoroughly. The almost smile was there, the one she had been cataloguing since the second evening, and it was closer to a full smile than she had seen it yet, and it did something to her face that she did not attempt to prevent. "Cavendish," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and she felt the weight of it, the small deliberate intimacy of it. "Yes," he said. "I would like to begin again," she said. Not from the beginning. There is no going back to the beginning, and I do not think I would want to, even if we could. But from here. From this morning, in this corridor, having told each other the truth, she paused. I would like us to know each other honestly, without the management of impressions, as I said. He looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was still and quiet around them, the house going about its morning beyond the walls, the sound of it soft and distant, and entirely separate from this. Yes, he said, simply, without qualification, just yes, and the steadiness of it settled into her chest and stayed. She nodded once, composed and warm and entirely herself, and then she turned and walked toward the staircase, because there was still the day to get through, and the house to navigate, and the business of Isolde's departure to be managed with dignity, and life did not pause itself for even the most significant corridor conversations. He fell into step beside her at the top of the staircase. Not behind, not ahead, beside. She did not remark on it. She simply walked, and he walked with her, and below them the house went on being a house, and the morning went on being a morning, and something that had been quietly and stubbornly growing since the second evening was no longer something either of them was pretending not to feel. Isolde's carriage left at 2 in the afternoon. Araminta watched it from the window of the library, where she had spent the hours between the corridor and luncheon in the company of Lady Cecily's considerable collection of books and her own considerably unsettled thoughts. She had not been avoiding anyone. She had simply needed, as she always needed, after a significant expenditure of feeling, the specific quiet of a room with no social requirements. The carriage moved down the long drive and through the gate and disappeared behind the tree line, and Araminta watched until the last of it was gone, and then she sat with what remained. She was not glad. Exactly. Glad felt too simple for it. What she felt was the particular relief of a thing resolved, tempered by the awareness that resolution was not the same as conclusion. Isolde Farwell and her father did not cease to exist because a carriage had taken her away from Aldenmere House. The disputed documents were still whatever they were. The old machinery of that grievance was still turning somewhere. Slower now, perhaps, checked in ways it had not been yesterday, but not stopped. Cavendish had said he was not unprepared. She believed him. She was also aware that not unprepared and easily resolved were different things, and that there were likely months ahead that would require him, and she supposed, eventually her, to navigate the consequences of an old man's long-held grudge. That was later. She had learned, over the past several years, the discipline of not borrowing trouble from the future when the present already had enough of its own. What the present had, when she set aside the morning's events and looked at what remained underneath them, was something quieter and more personal and considerably harder to know what to do with. She had told him she wanted to begin from here. She had meant it with her whole self, which was not something she said lightly, having spent most of her life meaning things only in portions, keeping the rest in reserve against the possibility of needing it back. She had handed him something real, and he had received it simply, without performance, without the particular kind of male graciousness that was actually condescension in a better coat. He had said yes, and meant yes, and walked beside her down the stairs. It was a beginning. She understood it as a beginning. She also understood that beginnings were frightening precisely because they were beginnings, open in all directions, unresolved, impossible to manage entirely. She was sitting with this when the library door opened. It was not him. It was Lady Cecily, who came in with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a woman who had decided to be somewhere and was not inclined to explain herself, and who sat in the chair across from Araminta's window seat and looked at her with the direct, intelligent regard that had dismantled Araminta's vague answers on the first evening. "You are thinking very loudly," Lady Cecily said. I am sitting quietly, Araminta said. You are sitting quietly and thinking very loudly. I have lived alone for a long time, and I have learned to tell the difference. She set her cane across her knees and folded her hands over it. How are you? It was a simple question, asked simply, and Araminta opened her mouth to give a simple answer and then stopped, because the simple answer was fine and the true answer was considerably more complicated. And Lady Cecily was not a woman you gave the simple answer to without her knowing exactly what you were doing. I am sorting through a great many things, Araminta said. Yes, Lady Cecily said. That is to be expected. A pause. He has gone to his study. He is also sorting through a great many things, in his way, which in his case involves going through correspondence he has already read and pretending to work. Araminta looked at her. Lady Cecily's expression was composed and faintly amused, and underneath the amusement was something warmer. He has been alone for a long time, Lady Cecily said, more quietly. Not in the way that people are alone when they have no company. He has more company than is good for anyone. In the way that matters. She paused. His father was not a warm man. He was a respected man, a capable man, and he loved his son, I believe, in the way that men of that generation loved their sons, which was at a remove, and through expectation, and without the language for anything more direct. She looked at her hands. Cavendish has been the Duke since he was 23. That is a long time to be responsible for everything and known by almost no one. Araminta was quiet, holding this, turning it over the way she turned over things she wanted to understand. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you are a woman who will want the full picture, Lady Cecily said, and because I am old enough not to be patient about things that matter. She looked at Araminta steadily. He will not rush you. It is not in his nature. He will wait, and he will be scrupulous about it. And if you need more time than this week and this house can give you, he will find a way to allow for that without making you feel the cost of it. She paused. I simply wanted you to know that the waiting is not easy for him, even when he makes it look easy. Araminta looked out of the window at the drive, now empty, the afternoon light long and golden on the gravel. He arranged all of this, she said, because he wanted to meet me honestly, without the weight of a formal introduction or an arrangement I had been prepared for. Yes, that is either very considerate, Araminta said, or very presumptuous. In my experience, Lady Cecily said, it is generally both. The best things usually are. She stood, retrieving her cane with practised ease. There is tea in the sitting room at 4. Come if you like, or do not come if you need more time with your loud thinking. She moved toward the door. He will be in the East Garden this evening before dinner, if the weather holds. He goes there most evenings. I thought you ought to know. She left without waiting for a response, which was very much in keeping with everything else about her. Araminta sat in the library for another half-hour. She read 3 pages of a book she did not absorb, and then put it down. She looked at the drive. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about her mother, who had loved her father not because it was practical, but because he had once made her laugh until she could not stand, and had never stopped making her laugh, and had held her hand in the last months with the steadiness of a man who understood that some things required the full weight of your presence and nothing else. She thought about what she had been building toward before she arrived here. The practical version of the future, the clean, functional shape of an arrangement that would keep her family's house and cost her nothing she had not already learned to live without. She thought about the 4th day and the conversation about the book, and the way he had said she was the first person in 3 years who had told him he was wrong about anything, and the look on his face when he said it, which had not been the look of a man performing vulnerability. It had been the look of a man startled by relief. She closed the unread book and set it on the table and went to find her coat. The east garden, in the early evening, was different from the early morning. The light came at a lower angle, warm and lateral, turning the stone path gold and laying long shadows across the rose hedge. The birds were louder. The air smelled of grass and something floral, and the cold of the morning had softened into the pleasant cool of a late afternoon in the country, the kind of air that made you feel more awake than you had been. He was at the far end of the path, standing near the old stone bench with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the garden with the expression of a man not looking at anything in particular. He heard her footsteps and turned, and whatever he had arranged his face into for the evening was not the face he had prepared. She walked the length of the path and stopped a few feet from him, and they looked at each other in the long evening light, and she thought about what Lady Cecily had said, about the waiting not being easy even when it looked easy, and she thought about the word particular, how he had been particular about wanting to meet her on honest ground, and she thought about beginnings, and the frightening openness of them. "I owe you something," she said. He looked at her carefully. "You owe me nothing." "An honesty," she said. "I told you this morning I wanted to begin from here. I meant that. What I did not say is why I meant it, and I think you should hear it plainly because you have been very plain with me, and it is only fair." He was still, the way he went still when he was paying full attention. "I arrived at this house prepared to be practical," she said. "I had made my peace with the shape of it. I was not unhappy. I was not hoping for anything beyond what was sensible. I want you to know that, because what happened in the days between arriving and this morning was not something I engineered or expected or frankly welcomed initially." She paused. "You were inconvenient." Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. The almost smile, closer now. "The fourth day," she said, "when you walked beside me without explaining why. I told myself it meant nothing. I was very thorough about it. I told myself it every day after, and it stopped working by the sixth day entirely, and this morning in the corridor I understood why." She looked at him directly, the way she had looked at him across the dinner table when she held his gaze 1 second too long, except there was no performance in it now, and no management, and nothing held in reserve. "I do not want the practical version," she said. "I want this, the actual version, the inconvenient one." She paused. "I wanted you to hear me say it clearly, because I think you have been waiting for it, and I think you have been too careful to ask for it, and I am tired of both of us being careful." He looked at her for a long moment in the evening light, and she watched his face move through something private and significant, and then he stepped forward, closed the remaining distance between them, and took her hand in both of his, the way he had taken the other woman's face in the garden, except that this was not a performance, and they were both entirely aware of the difference. "I have been waiting for it," he said quietly, "since the fourth day." She looked down at her hand in his, and then up at his face, and something in her chest that had been held at tension for the better part of a week released itself slowly, like a breath let out after a long time held. "We have a great deal still to navigate," she said. "Your father's old debts and mine, Lady Farwell and her father, my family, all of it." "Yes," he said. "I am not frightened of that," she said. "I want you to know that too." "I know," he said. "That is one of the things about you that has made all of this considerably more complicated than I was prepared for." She looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, simply and without qualification, and she believed it completely. The garden settled around them in the long golden quiet of the evening, and he did not let go of her hand, and she did not ask him to, and there was still the dinner to get through, and the rest of the week, and all the complicated ordinary machinery of two lives beginning to make room for each other. But none of that was here yet. Here was the stone bench, and the old rose hedge, and the same garden where something had broken in her chest 36 hours ago, now holding something entirely different. She thought, briefly, that her mother would have found all of it very satisfying. Not the difficulty, but the arrival. The moment when the thing you had been practical about turned out to have a heart in it after all. She let herself think that, and hold it, and not put it away. It was, she decided, a good place to begin. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Stay tuned for more exciting tales and updates. Your support means the world. And don't forget to tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?